I'm really looking forward to hearing what everyone was up to in the rooms. We're hoping that this will inform our work going forward and help us prioritize what we work on based on what came out of these groups. We also hope that this will inform all of your work, whoever you're here representing, and whatever work you're doing. We hope you'll find it useful too. We're going to start with the Getting to Zero session, Development of Pipeline Safety Standards.
Hi everyone, Max Kiba, PHMSA's Office of Pipeline Safety. I worked together with Sarah, so we're just kind of going to have a tag team approach. I do want to thank Bill and the PST team for giving us this opportunity to work through a new format. My leadership at PHMSA is often Masood or Alan calls me and say, hey, we've got something that's particularly a challenge we might want to work for, and I look on them as opportunities. So Sarah and I will walk through these together. You want to give overall approach?
Great. Yeah, so I'm Sarah Gossman. I'm a law professor at the University of Arkansas School of Law, and I'm also on the board of the Pipeline Safety Trust. So regulation is where I live. I love policy design. This was a conversation really about regulation. How do we create regulations? And we took on a particular issue of corrosion. So looked at corrosion as our case study in terms of how do we get to zero? What does getting to zero mean? So that was the setup. So let's talk a little bit about what we took out of it.
So from our common themes, so we kind of started with what zero comes first. So when we talk to zeros, how do we get there, how soon, and where do we go from here? I think the general theme, we definitely said we don't want to kill people, and then we don't want to injure people. So that's let's just start there. Let's stop with deaths. Let's stop with certainly injuries. And then there's layers there from there, like what exactly is an injury, what exactly is property damage. I brought examples, CO2 came up. Some landowners in Iowa are wondering, how does a leak affect my land and my cattle and things like that? Is that considered property as well? Intentional approaches to operator and system-specific characteristics that affect management of corrosion. So there's multiple ways to look at corrosion and what exactly is corroding, or the layperson term might be rust, which I think corrosion engineers hate that term, but what is essentially rusting? And then some operators, quite frankly, don't have as much of an issue of corrosion, even though we saw it in our stats that it is still a leading cause in others. And then we certainly expanded it out to other causes. So if an operator doesn't have corrosion, keep looking at it still, but also looking at what your other threats are. A lot of importance of data. Depth, specificity, accuracy, and intent. So what's the right data you're collecting to have your informed decisions? And it did center mostly around corrosion, inline inspections. Can you get unpiggable lines piggable? In some cases you can't, but if you can't truly get it piggable, are there other areas you have to look at? Again, from corrosion a little bit, but also in a grander scheme of some of your threats. And then certainly improving communication strategies and the challenges of information sharing. So let's collectively get a better job of communicating. And I say one of the biggest wins of this new format was just getting people at the table together of the different stakeholder groups and understanding more of the approaches. We had a really lively discussion. I think that alone was just a win. So thanks to PST for getting that together. And then, yes, overall interest in information sharing. What does that look like? Is it mandatory info? Is it voluntary? And others.
All right. Yeah, sorry, we have to keep switching here. Okay, good. All right, so next are challenges. So, one issue, of course, is we're working in a world where we have low probability, high consequence events. Like that's a big part, of course, of pipeline safety. So thinking about what do we do when, we are planning and managing, really. We don't have an event right now, right? But we have to think about managing so that we don't get an event in the future. So a challenge around, and so the way we describe that is what's happening when nothing is happening, right? We don't want to just rest on our laurels, right? We need to be thinking about risks proactively. Changing safety culture. So I think a lot of real interest in our session about safety management systems, but also, again, what does it mean to really change safety culture? Is this, it can't just be, right, that we're focused on safety culture. We also have to think about requirements, regulations, that kind of mix. finding the fine line between the types, the sort of tools that we're going to use really to address safety. So thinking about prescriptive regulations that are very specific, that tell operators directly what to do, versus ones that say, okay, we want this kind of performance from you, right? We want sort of this end here. And then throwing out there yet another one, we want you to engage in this management process. So which ones are best suited to which issue? Always constrained resources. The reality of constrained resources and this triangle of cost, time, and quality, right? We can consider cost, we can consider time, we can consider quality. Can we do all of these things at once? And then, I think a lot of terminology discussions. So what does it mean to have a prescriptive standard? What does it mean to have a performance-based standard? What does it even mean to have a standard? That's the term used in the statute, but that's also something we refer to in terms of private standards, standard setting by the industry or the API. So thinking about those terms, trying to be clear about them with each other and then into the future.
So then we got more into the push and pull of consensus versus some contrast, some good healthy discussion about some healthy conflict about some of our discussions. So definitely overall there was a support for voluntary information sharing in concept, but how exactly you get there is kind of, let's figure out, again, what are the regulations around it, what are the dynamics, if an operator submits information, does it automatically turn around to a violation, some of those aspects. So definitely, again, support of information sharing in concept, but how exactly you get it done and how much information is shared. The public understandably wants all the data and information if possible, but understandably, in some cases, you might not be able to. More intentional effort to define causation through data analysis to better inform action plan. This was probably a whole paragraph and page, so how do you get it into the bullet? But the idea is when an incident, more on being sort of more reactive, but when an incident happens, can you find out what that true cause is and then looking at the sub-causes? And then does that help with the safety management system? It's kind of the plan, do, check, act, or adjust in some cases. So then how does that better form your overall action plan as part of that act part? Advancing innovation, certainly for inline inspection tools. So then, since this got into the whole corrosion area, is how do you advance ILI wisely, but also looking at different aspects. And then again, going back to the case of making non-piggable lines piggable, how do you truly, can you make them piggable? In some cases, there might be some where you can't. So then what are the other layers of defense and other areas where you go from there? Clear connections between approach and rationale. Sarah, do you want to touch on that one and proven communication?
Sure, absolutely. So, we need to be thinking about the approach we're taking to regulation, the problem that we have, and why, right? All of these things need to combine to make a successful regulatory framework. I think we all agreed that we need to make those connections. They can't be separate, right, in separate silos. And a lot of discussion about communication. I feel like that's a thread throughout this conference, how, communicating between these different groups, communicating about corrosion, about the extent of corrosion, the risks of corrosion. Again, like sort of thinking about this between sort of government, public and industry, and in between, right? Sort of these various groups, or sort of within these groups, I should say. All right, and then do you?
Yep. So then safety management system, should it be required or not? We heard Elise Chair-Hamady kind of give her take a little bit. Quite honestly, our team went back and forth. Some felt it should be required. Some honestly talked about the scalability certain with operators, and then quite honestly, there was a discussion, is PHMSA and states even prepared to do, if you call them audits of a safety management system, but what does that even look like? It probably wouldn't be a traditional audit. I tried to think about what does a cost-benefit analysis even look like for SMS as a requirement. So again, the idea is we should certainly move forward in implementing, but when you get to actually requiring it, it does get challenging. And we have some bullets later of cost effectiveness, which Sarah kind of touched on, the 3 prongs. What approaches are best suited to regulations versus recommendations to best practices? So that's kind of when we talk about standards, that's kind of the evolution. It initially starts generally as a best practice, then it might go to an actual standard, and in those standards, they might have the recommendations on may or should versus shall. And then the regulations are pretty much, you must do this from the bare minimum safety standards or regulations requirements. How important is corrosion compared to other threats is certainly the whole idea. We just gave one case study, but there are so many other threats. We brought up excavation damage. We brought up so many other threats that are out there. And again, back to the theme, what's ultimately killing people? Sometimes those are all different causes and data, et cetera. And then finally, just deciding what are the right metrics to use to get to zero. So this whole, what are the lagging indicators, the leading? If I'm start seeing something, do I know if it's going to be an actual incident? And then we all talk about data. You can slice and dice different ways of data, but how do you truly normalize it? Does everyone agree what the data is saying in the metrics?
All right, so the last piece of our report here is on perspectives by stakeholders. So I'm going to go through them. I'm also going to say that one of the things that I really enjoyed about our session was people really talking with each other, right? Getting out of the sort of individual perspectives and being able to see sort of consensus and underlying interests that we all share. But obviously we also have specific perspectives on what we think is important about pipeline safety regulation. So from the public side, certainly transparent communication, accessible data, how to best engage, right? When we think about government, when we think about industry, how are they engaging with the public? How is the public engaging with them, right? And of course, I think this ties very much to the study that we heard about earlier this morning and thinking about meaningful public engagement. Turns out that needs to happen at all levels, right? And on issues as specific as corrosion as well as more generally. Do you want me to take the next one?
Yeah, go ahead.
All right. Yeah, perfect. So then in terms of stakeholders for the industry, I think the industry was concerned about regulations. How are we going to scale these requirements? The quality of those regulations versus we're just going to sort of add a bunch of requirements, right? That quantity issue. I also think that we're going to get to cost down there in a moment, but certainly cost was another piece of the puzzle here.
And then certainly the big theme across government and stakeholders, differing priorities on a push and pull of cost, effectiveness, and scale, and a good dynamic of, is the government the stakeholder here, or is it a reverse stakeholder of industry and the public? Or are we essentially decision makers when things get to regulation? So a lot of good, healthy discussion there, but certainly industry has this whole push and push of cost, effectiveness, and scale. And then when it comes to the government, it's probably a large government that makes the decisions. PHMSA is definitely a decision maker, but in healthy discussion with Office of Management and Budget, other scales of the government, and ultimately deciding cost effectiveness. We're going through this, we will be going through this right now. There will be changes without right now changing our statute, but what looks at cost. For instance, social cost of carbon in this current administration has been a big piece, but that may potentially change in the next administration. But at the end of the day, you get to a really difficult discussion, what is the cost of a life? And how could you truly put a cost to that? So that gets really difficult. But it is something we have to look at when we get into cost-benefit analyses. And then on SMS safety management system, again, kind of revisiting, but clear divisions, unintended scale of implementation and enforcement. And finally, this is hard for me, but so we learned about Liam and the boys. We heard about, and I carry around this woolly bulgur. It's one of Liam's favorite lures. But if you don't know Logan Hansen, he died just over 2 weeks ago. South Jordan, Utah incident, 15 years old. So if we're trying to get to zero, we're not there yet. You might not have seen in our data set yet because it was only 2 weeks ago. Usually there's a 30-day report. But Chair Hamidi did give a lot of good recommendations or accommodations of PHMSA, but I want to say thanks to NTSB. They already put out a preliminary report. So they're already putting information out there. But if Josh and Brenda Hansen are out there, if the South Jordan, Utah community is out there, we are working on this and we're looking at it. So again, let's stop killing people. Let's stop killing children. All right, thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for that. And yeah, thank you to both of you, and thanks to everyone in the room for coming back with that. And yeah, thank you for bringing up Logan. So the order we're gonna go in from here, we're gonna have maintaining safety with aging pipelines next. After that, we'll have pipeline siting and planning near pipelines. This is so I don't have to come up in between every time. And then we'll have preparing for and responding to pipeline emergencies, and then we'll close with emerging pipeline commodities. So if siting and planning could come up next.
All right, good morning, everyone. Max threw me a little, I'll be honest, on the closing comments there. I was launched as IAC for that investigation, and you got me a little bit. So I will ask Chuck to begin our presentation.
Okay. I'm Chuck Lesniak. I'm a private consultant, semi-retired. I focus on the public interests in environmental protection and pipeline safety. Go to the next slide. And I want to start by thanking all of our speakers. We had a really good group, and Sarah and Rob, who helped us put all this together, and Haley, on the PST staff, who was really great in helping us put all this together. And we had a very good group. They got really engaged, especially yesterday afternoon. And this morning, we had a really lively discussion. And so we talked about a lot. Aging is a really broad topic when you talk about pipelines. When you talk about aging, you think about old pipelines, but it's also new pipelines. That's age. You can have a young aged pipeline that can have issues. As I think Bill mentioned in his presentation the other day, that yesterday, the data shows that newer and older pipelines fail more frequently. That bathtub curve that was talked about, and these are some of our key takeaways from our discussion. Is older pipelines may be more likely to be in populated areas as urban and suburban growth encroach on what were rural areas, driving up the consequence component of the risk calculation. You may have a low probability, and we generally do in the pipeline industry have low probability failure rates, but when you drive up consequence, you drive up risk. And a lot of these old pipelines were in low consequence areas when they were put in place, and maybe today they're in high consequence areas. Most failures have age as a factor. This is something that was interesting to me. We talked about in the preparation for our session, and we talked a lot about today, and was sort of a common thread, sort of a common takeaway to the discussion, is almost any failure mechanism you can think of, age is a component. Even outside threats, we talked about older pipelines maybe in an area that's got a lot more population around it now. That is an age factor of the pipeline, that the risk of outside damage to the pipeline, that's an age factor. And so almost any incident you can name is a factor of aging. If you look at just aging of the pipeline itself, then even most mechanisms you can talk about, corrosions, construction dents, cracks, all of those have age-related components to it. Maybe the few exceptions are somebody running a rock saw through it. But if it's in an area where as the pipeline aged, there's more activity around the pipeline, that could be considered an age-related threat. One of the things we talked a lot about yesterday afternoon is that operators don't directly consider or define a pipeline's safe life. In a lot of industries, you design an airplane or something that has a predicted lifetime, and that lifetime can be extended as technology changes and that sort of thing. What we heard from the industry folks yesterday is generally they don't think in those terms of when they design a pipeline that it's got a design life. But what they do is they do incorporate age as a significant factor in their integrity management programs, that they take into account the age of a pipeline and what types of tools to use to inspect a pipeline, what things they take closer looks at, how frequently they might run a tool. So it's a significant factor in their integrity management programs and in their maintenance programs, maintenance inspection programs for pipelines. But they don't really look at, okay, when this pipeline was built, it had a 60-year life. That 60-year life is up in 2030. As we approach 2030, we're going to change how we maintain the pipeline or that. But they do incorporate that in sort of on a daily basis in how they maintain and inspect a pipeline. Regardless of age, old or new, there was sort of a general concern, especially amongst the public folks in the room, about putting pipelines in populated areas. I know the industry folks, they don't necessarily want to put a pipeline in a populated area if they don't have to, because it certainly increases the threats to their pipeline and the complications of operating and maintaining it. But that was kind of a general concern across the group.
All right, thanks, Chuck. So my name's Sarah Lyons. I'm the NTSB's acting deputy director for our Office of Railroad, Pipeline, and Hazardous Materials Investigations. I started at the NTSB as a pipeline accident investigator and have had the opportunity to supervise our pipeline accident investigators as well. And before I get started with our next slide, I'd just like to thank the Pipeline Safety Trust for putting this together. This was a great opportunity for me to get to have just candid conversations with different stakeholders, industry, the public, other government representatives. So thank you. Our working group came to the key findings that Chuck just went through, but we had great discussions yesterday and this morning, and I'd like to talk about kind of the way that we engaged in some of the challenges that we identified as far as safely managing aging pipelines. And this is a survey that we took within the group. So they're ranked from our highest priority as an overall group to lowest. So some of the challenges were limited data quality and resolution. So there's an interest and I think a technical capability to better predict when there might be challenges to pipelines, but there's limitations on data that holds us back from being able to do that. So that's something that our working group thought was very important to address. Cost of replacement, so when there's a decision that certain pipelines need to be replaced, the cost of replacement can be a challenge. And especially for distribution systems, the rate case needing to be approved through the Utility Commission was seen as another challenge, important challenge by our group. Transparency around construction and inspections of older assets. So many of our group members felt like there could be more transparency than there currently is now, as far as, they might see construction, but they have a hard time finding out or gathering the information on what exactly is going on with the project. We don't know what we don't know. That was something that we talked about a few times. Incidents happen and it might drive us to look into certain areas, but we talked about how important it is to get ahead of those incidents, but it's difficult because we don't know exactly where to focus that energy. And so that's a major area that could be explored more and perhaps help us all advance to the point of getting ahead of the incidents, getting to zero, as Sarah and Max discussed just a few minutes ago. We discussed with a presenter and amongst our group as well how there can be public resistance to investments in pipeline systems. So sometimes even when there's an identification that a system needs to be replaced and an operator that's willing to pursue that, that there can be resistance from the public. And the example that was given was groups that don't want pipelines to continue on. And so if you replace and reinvest in your infrastructure, then you may be perpetuating continued use of pipeline systems. And so that was a challenge identified by the group. And the other challenge was there are other threats than age, and some of them are also very important. And so that can be a challenge when you're looking at we were just looking at aging really, but when you're looking at the bigger picture, age is just one of the threats that needs to be mitigated, and sometimes the investment go to other areas. So within our working group, we had several areas of consensus. We had a good, healthy discussion on both areas of consensus and where we didn't have consensus. So I'll go over both of those with all of you. So one of the areas of consensus was safety is a priority for all of our stakeholder groups. So we had, government representatives, members of the public, industry representatives. Safety is a common goal for all of us. Aging is an important consideration in pipeline safety. We all did agree on that. As pipelines age, though, other factors can shift. Populations might move into certain areas. And we talked about even with excavation activity or excavation accidents that's often seen as not time dependent. I think Chuck mentioned this a bit, that maybe the depth of cover erodes, maybe the pipeline can't be located as well as more modern pipelines can be located, and so the risk of excavation can also be somewhat time dependent. Competing priorities make mutually agreeable solutions difficult. So getting everyone on the same page about exactly how to handle the aging problem is complicated. I mean, we had about a day to talk within our working group, but we talked about how we could really go on many of the subtopics for days on their own. The budget environment is complex. There are different views, like I mentioned a second ago, on what's the ideal energy mix for our country going forward, or for different localities, and all of that plays into how we collectively address different challenges related to safely managing aging pipelines. And there was a consensus that the public wants more education, transparency, and engagement through events like this, which are great, but other activities locally in their communities as well. Some areas of disagreement. Age doesn't necessarily equal deterioration. Some of our working group members felt like a design life would be the way to manage aging. Others didn't see that as a good way to manage it, that it's more design and then maintenance, and it's through the maintenance programs that you can manage the system going forward. There was different views expressed related to budget considerations and what roles they play in safety decisions. The role pipelines play in our energy future, we got into some discussion on, the future of energy in the U.S. and what roles pipelines play. So I think we all know there are various views on that. Support a resistance to further pipeline development, and accidents due to age-related threats are going down. So that's something that we heard from some of our members and presenters, but not everyone believed that was actually the reality. And this morning, after we had a nice long conversation yesterday, I just asked everyone how they were feeling about the engagement, being able to talk with each other, and these are the results that we had in a word cloud. So curious and encouraged. I think that's great feedback for us. There are some other thoughts as far as, maybe anxious and concerned, needing more information, more discussions warranted, or maybe different actions taken. Some weary and confused, or there's a lot of nuance and detail, and it is a complicated topic. So those all made sense to me. But overall, I think it was a good start for a healthy discussion with various stakeholders. So thank you to the working group, and thank you to the Pipeline Safety Trust and my co-facilitator here. That's all we have. Want to kick us off?
Good morning. I'm Dave Cheslow. I'm the Director of Gas Safety and Operations for the Michigan Public Service Commission. And responsibilities within our team include both pipeline safety and pipeline siting. So I have a unique and a little bit different perspective because we do get involved and engaged in both of the perspectives. So I was asked by the trust, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. Specifically Haley for leading our group. Thank you, Haley. And then all of our presenters and our panelists yesterday. Appreciate the effort and that everybody put into presenting and being a part of our group. So appreciate that.
And I'm Morgan Johnson. I'm a senior staff attorney at the Natural Resources Defense Council. I litigate and do policy related to pipelines in the context of our membership that's focused typically on community environmental issues and otherwise, and enjoyed co-facilitating our conversations yesterday and today. Our room was extremely active, and I think, was very evocative of the realities of pipeline siting and so many differing perspectives, but folks were active and engaged and leaned in. I think that definitely shaped the nature of our conversations in group. We didn't have as much a technical conversation as I'm hearing from some of the other readouts, but I think that was appreciated. Folks in the room, I think, really enjoyed engaging in some of the uncommon dialogues that we get to engage in this space every year. And so our sessions were filled with that and interactive, which Dave will touch on.
So the objectives were to look at balancing social and physical geographics. So, the social aspects and the physical aspects. And we had an exercise that we did with our group. So we gave our group a map that included 3 different pipeline routes for the same beginning point and the same ending point. So we asked them to look at both those social and physical aspects of the route and to make determinations and decisions on what route they would pick. We were pretty deliberate in trying to mix up our groups. So each table had a representative from industry, a public perspective, maybe an organizer, and then landowners. So we mixed the tables up. So we had different people at each table representing different interests. And what Haley was referring, or what Morgan was referring to with regards to the dialogue is the room was abuzz with all that dialogue. So it was a good exercise. It worked out really well, and Haley is handing out the maps that you can look at, and we have a map that we'll share with you and talk about some of the aspects. And so we'll talk about that, and then we'll talk about some of the takeaways and some of the priorities that we found from that exercise. So we're gonna flop the advantages and disadvantages. We're gonna talk about the advantages and the disadvantages up front. So this was one of the group's maps, and we gave them flags for areas of concern. And so you can see all the arrows that they put on their maps. So there was a northern route, a middle route, and a southern route. The middle route, as you can kind of see, is a short route, kind of a direct route. The southern route's a little longer, but more avoids some of the population density. And then the northern route has more population density along it. And then there's all different other kinds of geography issues that come along with that. One of the areas of agreement was safety. We didn't spend a lot of time talking about safety, but it was definitely a common thread through everything that we talked about. So everybody was concerned about that. We talked about the different commodities, and this specific exercise was related to an oil pipeline. So that was definitely influential in how people made their decisions and the things that they talked about at their individual tables. So that was really engaging. And I think people even thought about that they may have picked a different route if it was a different commodity that was being transported. So safety definitely was something that I think everybody in the group agreed was a common thread. But again, we knew that the other groups were having more discussion about safety, so we didn't spend a lot of time on that. I think one of the other common threads or themes was the shorter the route, the better, because there was less landowners impacted, less people that would be impacted. So that was an area of agreement, was a shorter route is probably more beneficial. At the groups, all the routes were picked. Each of the groups picked a different route, and all three of the routes, for different reasons, were picked. So there was not consensus. So that's an area of disagreement, I would say, is that the fact that each of the groups, based on the group's experience and their perspective, picked a route. Probably the most common route, I think, was the top route, which 3 of the groups picked the top route. But one of the groups picked the middle route, and a couple of the groups picked the bottom route. So there was not agreement with regards to the route. So that was kind of an interesting perspective. I think that the other thing that maybe was a common thread was a little better understanding and perspective from the industry's perspective. I heard a few people say that they understand the difficulty in picking a pipeline route after doing this exercise. So understanding a little bit more what the industry goes through when they're trying to decide on a route and some of the concerns and issues that they have to deal with in picking that route. Another area of disagreement was, one of the groups said that they would like to avoid the conservation areas, so like the forest areas that were under conservation agreements. And another group said that they wouldn't. They thought that it was more important to avoid the populated areas and put the pipeline in an area that was forested and maybe under a conservation agreement. So that was an area of disagreement, I would say. So just in general, some avoided the populated areas, but others didn't, and more that might be back to the fact that the commodity was oil versus a gas pipeline. I think that was all I had on that. I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Not for that exercise. I would just say, obviously this is the first time we've been doing this breakout model, and I've gone to Pipeline Safety Trust, this conference, for many years, and having the interactive element was really unique, and Dave Merck from API walked us through that and really appreciated his facilitation of that activity and dialogue afterwards. It was, unique but rewarding. So, from the conversations that we had, that activity and panels, there are some key takeaways that we wanted to bring into the broader room. I think the word we heard, I don't know how many times in that discussion, was transparency. Folks really had a desire across the board for more clear, current information and access to information throughout the siting process. Folks named, some relatively low-hanging fruit related to, like, which maps were being used and, not having access to the most current maps and processes. And there's definitely easily attainable ways we can make sure we're working with quality, accessible data, and, where community felt like they didn't have access to information, or government felt like they didn't have the same access to information, or industry. Between all of us, somewhere, in that room, in that fictional pipeline exercise, or in reality, that information is somewhere. It's just building more access to it is, desired and important. There was also an expression for interest for early engagement in siting processes, and not, the first time community members are aware of a project is when they're getting the letters, and, just making earlier engagement smoothens the process for everyone. And we had some really helpful folks, describing engagement approaches that worked really well, folks sharing, where they did more targeted or early engagement when that worked, folks sharing when engagement did not work. So we had a lot of conversations about that. And then lastly, the exercise was indicative of it, but so were our conversations, that we're balancing a lot of interest in siting conversations, and the community members who were in the room and folks from the public had shared that, we're hoping to have better public processes and better process start to finish in the siting context. And so there was just heavy public participation, heavy engagement conversation, and those were our biggest takeaways. And some action items that we came out of the room with. There were folks from industry in our room who voiced a desire to, implement best practices that are existing to help with that engagement and help decide at what junctures, do we want to start reaching out and what that looks like. And so that sounds like that's an ongoing conversation there's, desire to have. And this obvious opportunity to really get together and share in that room, maybe while we still have, a few hours of post this session networking, we can start having that conversation, which is great. Also, folks were looking for opportunities to increase transparency for operators and regulators. A big part of our conversation was that in the siting context, there's kind of no one sole regulatory authority, and then for emerging areas, there's a lot of folks interested in carbon pipeline issues that kind of having more conversations about the regulatory landscape is homework for all of us. We talked about the currentness with data, and then just lastly, for community folks, there was an expression that, for them, as they are navigating siting processes, to have more channels within their own community to share information. And so that was just a few of our action items. Thanks. We had a really great couple days. We had some good conversations. We had some tough conversations too. But I really appreciate the opportunity to converse and lean in. That was something that was expressed by everyone coming from all sides. And so hopefully we get to continue these sorts of uncommon dialogues in future years of trust conferences. So thank you.
So good morning, everybody. I'm Karen Gentili, and I am one of the community liaisons at PHMSA, the Pipeline and Hazardous Material Safety Administration.
And I'm Virginia Wiltshire-Gordon, and I'm the Community Engagement Manager with Pipeline Safety Trust.
And Virginia and I had the opportunity to co-facilitate the session on preparing for and responding to pipeline emergencies. And we had a great group, lots of discussion, lots of activity, and we wish we had more time, bottom line. So our group, we started off hearing from 8 panelists, and each one of our panelists provided different perspectives based on their expertise and their background. And we also heard different pieces related to the different stages of an emergency, to include planning for, responding to, and then following up after an an emergency. And I'm going to quickly go through here just to give you an idea of the diverse backgrounds and different perspectives that we were able to hear from each of these panelists. You can read the titles yourself, but basically we kind of broke it out into sections. So we had prior to an emergency and immediate response, and we were able to hear from Texas 811, CAMO focused on underwater pipeline facilities. We had pipeline operator Jared from Phillips 66. We heard from local emergency response perspectives. We had Mayor Kaag from West Reading, Pennsylvania. We had a reporter from E&E News and Politico. And we also had the Standing Rock Sioux provided information from their perspective. And these were all related to perspectives related to specifically emergency response and their experiences with a response. And then we had a couple more panelists who focused on the following of an emergency, what goes on. So we heard from NTSB as well as PHMSA's Accident Investigation Division. So after the panelists, we had the opportunity for individuals to get together, share their experiences on these different panelists' perspectives that they provided. And there was, again, a lot of great discussion and information sharing. And again, we as facilitators, we had to unfortunately cut people off of the discussions because there was a lot of engagement and a lot of good opportunity to share information. We did find that, we would hear what people were doing in their individual roles, but those people were focused on their roles, and they didn't necessarily know, outside of their bubble, what was involved elsewhere. So just to give a quick example, we'd hear from emergency response, we'd hear from a pipeline operator on all the activities they go through in planning for and preparing for an emergency. And we could see, members of the public's eyes light up on the fact that, oh, wow, we didn't know all these things were going on. So again, a lot of good discussion and engagement there. So after we heard from the panelists, our breakout group as well had an exercise where we went through these questions and there was opportunity to provide information, and we had these questions related to resources, expectations, accountability, information, communication, and planning. And based on, after we had a very interactive exercise, lots of moving, lots of shuffling points, and people exchanging and sharing their information and ideas, what we did is we tried to come together and consolidate this information. And that was it was a hard task because, again, there was a lot of different diverse people in the room with a lot of different experience and people coming from different perspectives. And based on all the discussions that we did have, we came up with some key themes that were important to the group. So people, ultimately, they can stay safe if they do have to respond to an emergency, and the impact to the environment can be minimized. So the key findings that we came up with were communication and transparency. I think this was a common theme that was heard throughout the conference, and it was no different in our breakout session. There was an overall willingness to collaborate. We saw this with our group, and again, lots of good discussion. I think we want to collaborate and share information, but there are some questions. We don't know what people don't know. I think we heard that before too. People don't know what they don't know. And people are resource constrained, so they're working to do their job, but they don't necessarily know that people need and want information unless that communication happens. Tailored planning. Advanced planning came up, specific to pipelines. Was one point that was mentioned. Communities might have emergency response plans, but they might not be tailored specifically to a pipeline emergency. So that was pointed out as something that was done, and an essential component of that is doing exercises and drills. Also, as part of that tailored planning is to factor in community knowledge and perspectives and community organizations to include them, again, on pipeline-specific planning. So that information is provided to all stakeholders, and that it's physically received was a big thing. So you can physically hand information to people, but is it really received was a big thing. Are people getting the information, paying attention to it, and are they understanding the information that they receive? And then there was recognition that people are all resource constrained these days, and they're strapped for time, personnel, attention, and other resources.
Great. All right, so we talked a lot about different challenges in responding to and preparing for emergencies. As Karen mentioned, specifically paying attention to pipeline preparedness is difficult because emergency responders are paying attention to all types of emergencies. And so being clear about what needs to happen for pipelines, what makes pipelines different, came up. It's also a challenge to have appropriate sharing of response procedures. You know, people want transparency, but sometimes making sure that it's at the right level can be difficult, and that it's getting to the right people. We also talked about emergency responder resources, training, and personnel, and making sure that, you know, people have what they need. There also was, this is local emergency planning councils. There's variability in that, even though those are such important groups. That's a challenge. And then ensuring, as Karen mentioned, that ensuring that information, even if you're providing it, making sure that people are really digesting it, implementing it, that remains a challenge. We also talked a little bit about reporters, that those are sometimes the media is leaned on to get the message out, to report on matters, but there are really limited resources in our landscape for journalism and reporting, which just means that it can be difficult for the public to find out about things. And then something that came up as a really important addition as well is to talk about non-regulated lines. A lot of the time we're talking about regulated pipelines and emergency response plans that operators are required to have, and you know, there's a lot of preparation around that, but when we're talking about non-regulated lines, that's a whole different area, and the preparedness is very different, and so that was a challenge. We did have some areas of consensus, which was really great, specifically, of course, to protect people in the environment. We also talked about taking care of yourself and others. That was important to everyone in the room. We talked about communication and transparency as really important, and that preparedness and collaboration really can save lives. Our next area of consensus, that emergency responders may need more specialized training, equipment, better standard operating procedures related to pipeline emergencies. There is a lot that's already happening. Emergency preparedness, emergency responders do have resources. Operators are putting out really great material, but it's not always getting through. And there may be a need for more specialized training that's specific to pipelines again. We also thought, everyone, I think, agreed that strengthening partnerships would be really beneficial across all of the different groups and stakeholders, and then easier access to information, communication channels, and timely communication as well. We did have plenty of areas of disagreement and healthy discussion. The first one was that during our activity, we focused on prioritizing things based on effort versus impact, and so things rating things, are they high effort? Would you say that they're low effort? Is something going to make a big impact if we do it? Is it going to be a low impact? And there really was a lot of different opinions and variability in that, where you see maybe someone else is doing something and you think, oh, that's really easy for them to do, or you are doing something yourself and you say, well, it's been really easy for me to do. But for others, they may look at that and say, that's really difficult, that's really hard, that's a challenge for us. And so that was very interesting to see. We also definitely talked about risk, and so risk criteria specifically varies, and what is acceptable risk, and it's also talking about what is it that you are really trying to protect and value, and we have varied opinions about that in this room, so that was definitely interesting to talk about. And then talking about the appropriate transparency and involvement of the public, finding ways to make sure that emergency responders are getting the training that they need and the expertise that they need, but also members of the public should not be left out. And so what is the appropriate way, what programs? We talked a little bit about CERT as a great way to involve the public potentially, but what are the ways that the public can be involved well? And we did go through some different stakeholder perspectives. So for members of the public, we talked about lack of awareness and knowledge, needing support in understanding pipeline emergency preparedness and response. That's always a challenge. And there was definitely experience with the local emergency planning committees, which are really a major resource for emergency response. They're very varied across the country. They're often at the county level, and so some are really engaged and you can really go and get involved, and some are not. Some are not available to collaborate with. From a government perspective, we heard from Mayor Kaag, who they had a recent pipeline explosion, so that was really powerful to hear from her and her community members who lost their lives in that explosion. But local officials may not have the training in emergency response and support, so she, as a mayor, is directing this response sometimes, but she didn't necessarily have that training or could use support in leading those well. We also talked about a little bit the relationship between requirements and effectiveness. So sometimes having more government requirements is really helpful in making sure that things are happening, but sometimes they get in the way. And so that relationship between the two can be contentious. And then for the government as well, I think just we heard the importance of the operator and public involvement, that the government is not necessarily acting alone, but is really working with those other groups as well. We did hear from our local emergency responders and fire departments, and sometimes there is a lack of awareness or knowledge about pipelines. There is a lot of awareness, and many people are trained, but some people do not know that there even are pipelines in their area or where they're located. They're not aware of MPMS, for example, and understanding that there are mapping tools that are available to them. And so there also can be a lack of awareness of how to respond to a pipeline incident. This is not everybody, but some communities need some more investment in these areas. And then we did mention as well that for product-specific information for any product, because that can change, has different batches in a pipeline, for example, but especially for emerging products as well, so like CO2 and hydrogen, that was a challenge for these local responders. And generally, they are under-resourced and facing a crisis of missing adequate personnel. So that was something we heard very strongly, and certainly impacts the ability of local departments to respond to pipeline emergencies. We did hear from our Indigenous perspectives. The recognition of sovereignty is very needed and important, and there is difficulty in accessing information and resources at that level. So we were glad to hear that perspective. Our operators in our room really shared a lot, which was wonderful. Operators are already contributing for emergency preparedness and response, and the public is not always aware or understanding what all of the different steps that operators are taking are. And so that was really important to come through, that operators are investing in emergency response. They have many plans and different things going on, and the public is not always recognizing that. But the operator also has an obligation to protect their information and be careful with that, and so that was kind of, that can cause some tension as well, but it's important for the operators to be careful of that, so that was from their perspective. we also heard that about the importance of getting the basics right. And so thinking about, trying to do a really good job of informing everybody and collaborating and doing all of these different things is great, but also just the basics of making sure that you're responding to emergencies, you're doing your leak detection, you're doing, all of the things that you need to do as an operator to get your basics right was really important, and prioritizing that. And then also there was a recognition that their assets are different across contexts, and so operators are looking at that, and there's not just a cookie cutter response plan, but they are differentiating their plans across the product and the pipeline, and making sure that those are specific to what's happening. And I think that is it. Big thank you to our group. We really had a really wonderful discussion, and everyone was really contributing, and so a lot of appreciation, and also for our speakers who gave really great perspectives. And that's it. Thank you.
All right, hello everyone. My name is Amanda McKay. I am the policy manager for the Pipeline Safety Trust. And I just want to start us off by saying I really appreciate everyone for sticking with us to this point, for continuing really good engaged conversations, and for just embracing this new format. It's new for all of us, and it's been a really great learning opportunity, and so I hope that everyone enjoyed it. I'll let my co-facilitator introduce himself.
Good morning. I'm Jeff Whitworth with PRCI. I'm the director of the Emerging Fuels Institute, and that was the foundational discussion that Amanda and I co-led for the last couple of days in our breakout session.
Yeah, so we led the breakout session on emerging pipeline commodities, and when we were initially formulating this breakout session, I was like, how are we going to get to all of this? And we didn't. So that was, it was exactly what I expected, but so much more. I think we had some really great discussions, but we also addressed the fact that this is a really complex topic. Emerging pipeline commodities, you're talking about carbon dioxide pipelines, hydrogen pipelines, blended fuels, including hydrogen blending, renewable natural gas, sustainable aviation fuel, and each one of those commodities is unique. Each one of those commodities has its own technical challenges. Each one of those commodities has its own jurisdictional challenges, and safety risks as well. And so, I think this was a really big topic to take on, and I think that our group did a really great job discussing some of what we went through. But Jeff's going to walk us through what we did in the room.
Yeah, so I'm going to helicopter up and give a little context for the emerging fuels discussion. And as Amanda pointed out, we talked about emerging fuels like hydrogen and RNG. And when I first got into this 3 years ago, I questioned, how does carbon dioxide fit into all this? So I wanted to put that into context real quick. So the discussions focus around clean burning new fuels like the hydrogen and RNG, and then carbon capture, or CO2, really is on the back end for existing resources that will still be burning hydrocarbon fuels, for instance, power plants, ethanol facilities, cement plants. They still are going to have emissions with CO2 in them, and so the other side of the equation is how do you capture that CO2? So between clean burning fuels and capturing that CO2 and then pipelining it through presumably some infrastructure to new underground storage facilities, it's a two-pronged approach on how we're addressing this. And so kicking the meeting off, we started off by providing context from a regulatory perspective, from a research perspective, and then from a public perspective, just to gain context in the room on what does the emerging fuels world look like from Jeff's eyes as a researcher? What does it look like from the Wisconsin regulators' perspective, and what is their challenges? And then again, from the public perspective. So we all are coming at it from a different angle, and we kind of wanted a level set in the room on here's what perspective looks like from those three different vantage points. And that was good information. We had some breakouts where we put together concerns, basically reflecting on what we'd heard and what sparked in your mind new information based on that work. And then in the afternoon, we really had a rich panel discussion with 5 panelists, focusing anywhere from financial perspective, jurisdictional. In other words, when you create a new a plan for a pipeline, what jurisdictions are you subject to? That's something that I don't pay a lot of attention to, but it's obviously very real. There's a regulator, so Masood provided his regulatory perspective, and we also had a climate person involved to provide what's going on from a climate perspective. So we had some really good, rich discussion in that area, again with the purpose of creating or provoking thought and then capturing these thoughts and putting them into a bulleted lists on what we wanted to do going forward. And so that's really what Amanda will kick off here and start to talk about.
Yeah, so after we had all of our speakers, our panelists, we really tried to capture some of the common themes from those discussions after that context setting. And so one of the most common theme that I was not fully expecting out of this group is just that it seemed like there was a lot of talk around how the financial incentives for these emerging commodities often can have the ability to move very quickly and are driving an increased build out of emerging commodity pipelines. But then right after that, we're talking about what does the regulation look like? Where is the research at? And we came to this kind of consensus that we know regulation takes a really long time. We know research takes a while because we want to get it right. But that's a concern when you're thinking about the financial incentives pushing ahead. Another thing we talked about, and I think this is really powerful, and we've seen this theme across the different rooms, but that we're talking so much about public engagement, and I think something that I've noticed from last year's conference to this year's conference, all of the great work that industry, regulators, members of the public, others have done is pushing towards public engagement, but I don't want public engagement to become this buzzword. And so it's like public engagement is great, but that's not the end. Change is better. How do you actually incorporate what you're engaging the public on into real change? And then accountability is the goal. How do we keep everyone accountable for that engagement process? So I thought that was a really great theme that came out of our room. Definitely one of the themes was talking about the regulatory issues around these emerging commodities. They're all so different. Between the commodities themselves, the regulatory issues are different, but then you look at state, local, federal, it's all challenging. And there's a lack of consistency and or lack of approval process. And just thinking about kind of bringing it back to the first bullet, really speeding ahead without this modern seatbelt, whether that be research, regulations, public engagement, it makes communities feel wary. It makes communities concerned. And so it's like this cycle that we need to figure out. Another thing that we talked about, and this kind of leads in from the last slide, is just some of the challenges. We know that these financial incentives are moving really fast, often faster than some of the regulation updates and technical research that's being done. And we know that transporting these emerging commodities comes with real technical challenges and safety concerns. We identified one of the challenges as being a lack of coordination and transparency among different stakeholder groups, whether that be industry, research, interagency coordination, members of the public. It's very disjointed. How can we move it towards a more coordinated process? Something like one of the challenges that it's just this really big lift is how do we incorporate community feedback into the permitting process? And again, not just incorporating the feedback and checking a box, but saying, okay, that feedback was actually heard, and we're going to implement that into how we move forward. And then coming back to that financial conversation is, how do we incentivize safety? How do we incentivize true public engagement? How do we make it something that actually works? And so I thought that was a really, really great identified challenge, because it's not an easy thing to solve. And so just looking at some of the stakeholder perspectives that we had in the room, we had members of the public. We know that members of the public are often skeptical about the actual benefits, climate, environmental, of these emerging fuels. And they're genuinely concerned about the safety issues of using this existing infrastructure that we have, or building out new infrastructure without knowing or being certain about what potential benefits might be in play. And then, of course, we heard a lot of concerns from members of the public about accessibility of information and community consent, whether or not communities have a say in whether or not these projects go through them. From the regulator government perspective, it's really just seemed like seeking consistency and clarity. Again, there's so much inconsistency in the jurisdictional and regulatory aspects of all these emerging commodities, and so that was a major theme there. And then also just knowing that government and regulators need to know about these projects early in order to properly regulate to ensure safety. So if you don't, we heard this before, you don't know what you don't know until you know, and then what do you do about it? And so we don't want our regulators finding out about new projects after they're already in place. That's a major concern. And also just genuine interest in finding new ways to interact with the public, especially around these emerging commodities. And then from the industry perspective, the struggle to earn trust, learning new ways to communicate, figuring out how to genuinely engage with communities, and strategizing new ways to communicate early and often. We heard that a lot. And then also a recommendation to formalizing the permitting process that requires kind of an acknowledgement and a resolution of these issues. That's something that industry is looking for as well. All right, and Jeff's going to talk about the consensus and disagreements we had in the room.
Yeah, and overall, the consensus and the disagreement side of the House, it was like everybody else shared. We all sat down not knowing each other, and we ultimately realized there was a lot of common threads between the groups, regardless of where your background resides from. And it ties back, I think, to the NTSB discussion the other day. We're all here because we're concerned genuinely about safety, just from coming in from different perspectives. And so I think we all agreed the consensus was around trust. And the theme is that a lot of times we're separated because we need to develop trust. And ultimately, trust takes a long time to develop. And then if done the wrong way, a project can create new divides and just distinguish that trust. And sometimes you never get it back. And so the bullets here underneath the first bullet about trust are really some of the ways we gain trust, right? And it's easy to say trust is something that needs to be gained and great, but we need to put steps together, concrete steps, and figure out what we do going forward. So from the research perspective, I was kind of taken aback because I heard, we focus on research and we put out information that ideally drives standards and regulations. That's our goal, is to make the world a safer place through research that shows we can do better. And when we do that, what I realized was, well, the public doesn't necessarily see those benefits, or certainly isn't acknowledging or capable of getting that information if we don't provide an avenue to do so. So we have to do a better job on the research side of somehow publicizing that information, or certainly access to that information. And there's a few things we're doing within PRCI to get that out there, and that's a whole nother discussion, but we've created some publicly accessible information. But the fact that people in the room don't know about it, well, it's great if it's sitting there, but if you don't know it's there, there's a big gap there that we still have work to do. And so in the end, I think that's the research side. In the regulatory side, I was really floored when I heard from our Wisconsin regulator who spoke in the room that there were pipelines being built, RNG pipeline that was built that they never knew existed or was being presented or constructed. No shortcoming on their side. It's just that the regulations and the policies don't exist that say when you turn a shovel, it's time to call your local regulator first, regardless. So there's a gap there, obviously. That's a key area of consensus in the room. We all agree that this is an issue. And then something Amanda's been talking about, is the process going on too quickly right now? All these financial incentives, the 45, whatever letter of the alphabet it is, QZ, the people are receiving government funds and saying, we're going to go ahead and build CO2 assets. I think they can be done safely, but in the end, it's a horse race and the horses aren't even close together. We need to do a better job of consolidating this information, making sure that it's appropriately shared with the communities as it was in Iowa, and making sure that there is an information loop that's established to go forward to make sure that we're all working hand in hand as opposed to somebody sneaking in with a financial grant to go build a pipeline, and we only find out about it in the bottom of the ninth inning. So that was the consensus side. The disagreement side, not necessarily things that were unexpected, but the question that we really don't know is, are the safety risks really worth the benefit? And we don't know right now. All we're hearing is we got to go. We got to build CO2 pipelines. We have to look at hydrogen and building a hydrogen infrastructure. And we've been told that this is the way to address global warming or to address climate change. But where is that document really sitting? Have we all gotten on board with that first and said, job one is to agree on that, and then let's talk about CO2 and hydrogen pipeline infrastructure? There's a gentleman I was talking to this morning sitting at the table, and that was his question is the benefit proven there? And so, good question. The inference is yes. It can't be as bad as building a new natural gas system if you can put a hydrogen line in place to deliver the same amount of energy. So that's a question to be asked. And there was disagreement in the room because we really don't know where that information exists. Should we be funding build-out before the research and regulations are updated? Similar to the financial challenge, right? You got financial grants being provided and work going on out there, yet we're waiting on, not to pick on PHMSA, but we're waiting on the new CO2 notice of proposed rulemaking, right? That would sure be nice to have for the Summit pipeline that's been approved. And I'm just getting out over my skis there because I don't know all the details. I'm sure the details explain all that. But in the end, we're looking to build assets right now, but yet we're waiting on new regulations. So I think that's kind of the context of where the agreements and disagreements were in the room. And then lastly, what are our action items? And what we decided, we were looking at some of the prior presentations here, and we thought, golly, did we get too much in the weeds, or were we really too detailed? But I said, hey, our heart is in a spot to make change here. And I like what Amanda said when we were talking off to the side. We want to create tangible change, not talk about the same thing a year from now. We're in the room again. So we want to come in the room next year and show what we did as a result of the output of this meeting to move forward down the river, and then we'll start further down the process next year to continue the journey to improve on things. And so one of our thoughts is to create an group or an ad hoc group of people who are in our room. Raise your hand, and we will start having recurring phone calls to continue this discussion, to expand on it, not just walk away and go, wow, that was really cool, but we're hoping somebody else makes the change and the problem solves itself. That's not how it works. So we're really wanting to take a stakeholders view on this and start pulling in our regulatory folks who are in the room here. We're all here. We can get this done. So I think that was the basic idea. Step two is something that we don't necessarily have the ability to pull on, but we're certainly anxiously waiting for the new CO2 regulation to come out. And that will help provide us some guidance for this discussion we're talking about in the first bullet around having this ad hoc group. And ultimately, I touched on this earlier, but continuing the research conversation, the Pipeline Research Council, which I work for, has a 6-year plan, and we're 3 years into it. And so we need to do a better job communicating through this forum and others to make sure everybody has access and is aware of the work that we're doing and the outputs. It's not just the work. Oh, they've got 38 hydrogen projects. Well, what are we finding? And putting it into a format or sharing that information in a context that people all understand and can get their head around. So I think that's a big aspect as well for action items. And then lastly, it all really wraps up to incentivizing safety, and what does that really look like? Our regulations right now are pretty well defined, but ultimately, when there's a leak, as a former industry participant, whether it's a leak that was on us, that we just did something boneheaded, that's one extreme. The other extreme is third-party damage when somebody hits your line you had nothing to do with. There was a recent incident in Houston where somebody drove off the road and hit a valve site and caused a big fireball, and it was all in the news, industry bad, industry bad. It's like, it's bad because perhaps that should have been buried, but it was above ground for a reason. And so, how do you really process all this information to tamp out process safety incidents to meet goal zero? And I thought Cliff had a really good comment yesterday about just, if regulation said 0 is the expectation and you go above that water line, you're going to pay the price. And that's kind of ugly, but there's all sorts of discussion to be had on how we do better. And I think these are the thought-provoking ideas that we want to carry on into this continued discussion. And anybody who's in the room that feels so compelled to do so, just let Amanda know, because I'm all jacked up and we're going to get this thing going. So, thank you.
Thank you.